Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my in-depth review of the Sony FE 100mm f2.8 Macro G Master, a long-awaited new close-up lens for their full-frame system. It is capable of 1.4:1 reproduction, or 1.4 times magnification, and that's comfortably greater than life-sized 1:1 without the need for bellows, tubes, or teleconverters. That said, it is actually compatible with teleconverters, allowing up to 2.8 times magnification and still with autofocus, a first as far as I know. Announced in September 2025, it comes 10 years after the previous FE 90mm 2.8 Macro G, which delivered lower 1:1 reproduction. It couldn't use teleconverters, and it had questionable sealing. Now, while the 90mm was, and still is, a decent macro lens, a decade is a long time in this game, and lest we forget, Canon's been selling a 100 2.8 macro with 1.4:1 reproduction for 4 years now. I've no idea why it's taken Sony so long to make a new model, and I've certainly been requesting one every time I see them, but it's finally here and not only joins their high-end G Master catalogue, but also boasts greater magnification than its predecessor by matching the Canon RF with 1.4 times magnification. But unlike the Canon, it'll also work with teleconverters. It costs around $1,500 with the latest pricing linked below. Compare that to the old 90mm, which still sells new for around $1,200, and that's coincidentally roughly the same price as Canon's RF 100mm 2.8 macro. But if you're a Sony macro shooter on a tighter budget, you could also consider Sigma's 105mm 2.8, which gives you 1:1 reproduction for around $880, or maybe even adapting an old Canon EF 100mm 2.8 macro, which also delivers 1:1 and can be bagged for even less, especially on the used market. So let's find out if Sony's new macro can justify its high price. First off though, what does 1.4:1 actually look like? Here's a focus stacked shot I took with the new lens from its closest focusing distance for the maximum magnification. This is 1.4 times bigger than life size on the sensor, making those coffee beans look absolutely enormous. Which segs nicely into a quick mention for my new coffee channel, where I review the best cafes around the world. So if you're into coffee and visiting nice cafes, check out my Gordon Gets Coffee channel. Cheers, and now on with the review. The new Sony lens measures 81 by 148mm, weighs 646 grams, and is sealed against dust and moisture, and that includes a rubber grommet at the mount. Interestingly, the previous 90mm also claimed weather sealing to some degree, at least in some of the specification sheets, but I don't recall seeing a grommet at the mount, or at least not a significant one, so the new version should be improved in that regard. Certainly I felt a lot more confident taking the new lens into highly humid environments like the butterfly farm that I visited for some of my tests, which I'll show you in a moment. The new lens is a tad larger and heavier than the earlier 90mm macro, which measured 79 by 131mm and weighed 602 grams, but once you have them both mounted and in use, they really are a similar proposition. The controls start with a bank of switches. At the top is DMF to enable full-time direct manual focusing. This lets you autofocus as normal, but then fine-tune with a turn of the manual focusing ring without having to switch any modes. It's actually a really useful feature to have on a macro lens, where the tiniest of adjustments can actually make a huge difference to what's in focus. It's a nice feature to have over the old 90mm. Next comes a focus limiter switch with either the full range or 2 reduced ranges, from infinity to 5 meters for general use, or 26 to 70 meters for close-ups. Like other macro lenses, it can really help the autofocus system to limit this range, especially when shooting very close. Next, there's a switch for the optical stabilization, which is also very useful for handheld macro shooting, as you'll see in a moment. Below this, you can lock the aperture ring to A for body-based control, while on the opposite side of the lens barrel is a switch to declick the aperture ring for smooth operation if preferred. Next comes the actual aperture ring, a control that was missing from the original 90mm. It runs between f2.8 and 22 in third stop increments, and again there's an A position for body-based control, which can also be locked. Next are a pair of customizable focus hold buttons, along with an AF/MF switch. And finally to the generously wide manual focusing ring, which works similarly to the previous 90mm model. This employs a push-pull clutch mechanism to set it between focusing modes. With the ring pushed outwards, the lens is set to autofocus, albeit with optional manual override if you have the DMF switch enabled. I found this great for quickly getting close to the subject before then fine-tuning manually, and the ring feels silky smooth in operation. In this mode, notice how you can independently turn the ring with the focus distance and magnification markings in order to, say, preset a distance when switching between auto and full manual focus. Or you can pull the focusing ring back towards the body with a click and it'll couple with the distance and the magnification rings for full manual focus operation with a broad 180-degree throw, allowing very precise adjustments and hard stops at either end. Note, as before, this is still a fully motorized manual focusing system, so there's no direct mechanical coupling here, but Sony's design still does a great job at feeling very connected to the process. At the end of the lens is a 67mm filter thread, and Sony supplies a cylindrical hood that twists onto a bayonet mount. Okay, now for my tests, and first I want to start with close-ups by showing what this lens can do in a macro environment. I used a Sony a7R5 for all of my tests here. Now, most macro lenses deliver what's known as 1:1 or life-size reproduction. This means the subject is the actual size on the camera's sensor. So if it's a coin that's 20mm in diameter, then it will be 20mm wide on the sensor. And since a full-frame sensor measures around 36 by 24mm, you'll be able to fill the frame with a subject measuring that same size, for example a large postage stamp. To illustrate this, here's a ruler I photographed with the new Sony lens at 1:1, where, as expected, you're capturing 36mm across the frame. The centre is nice and sharp, wide open, but for the edges to match at this distance, you're going to need to close the aperture down a bit. Now you can achieve 1:1 reproduction at a distance of 28cm from the focal plane, which in practice works out about 11cm from the actual tip of the lens, as seen here. But as you know, the new Sony goes further by offering 1.4:1 reproduction, which as seen here is capturing about 26mm across the frame. So that's greater than life size, and like the Canon RF macro lens, you're also enjoying autofocus. Again, you'll enjoy sharper corners if you stop it down though. Now the Sony lens delivers this maximum magnification at a distance of 26cm from the focal plane, remember that's inside the camera body, so that works out about 9cm from the tip of the lens. This may look pretty close, but in macro terms it's reasonably distant, allowing you to not cast a shadow on your subject or disturb it, say if it's an insect. But unlike the Canon lens, the Sony can also use either a 1.4 or 2x teleconverter to deliver maximum reproductions of 2:1 or 2.8:1, and again still with autofocus. You can do this from a little further away from the focal plane too, but the teleconverter will push the lens out by about the same amount, so again your subject is going to be about 9cm from the tip of the lens. So here's how it looks at 2.8:1, delivering about 13mm across the frame. This is a significant upgrade over not just the Canon at 1.4:1, but especially the previous Sony macro which stopped at 1:1. And while companies including Laowa and Canon have made macro lenses with similar or even larger reproductions, they're manual focus only, which is slower to use, especially when focus bracketing, and in that case normally requires a focusing rail too. To illustrate why focus bracketing is an important tool for macro photography, here's a shot of a UK pound coin from the closest focusing distance of the Sony lens. Now the coin measures 23.5mm in diameter and it's 2.8mm thick, so with a 1.4:1 reproduction it almost fills the width of the frame. Now this is a single frame taken with the aperture closed to f5.6, where the razor thin depth of field is pretty apparent even when closed by a couple of stops. And even when close to f16 or 22, you're still not going to get the whole coin sharp at this distance and angle, plus you're going to be suffering from softness due to diffraction at that point. The solution is focus bracketing, where a sequence of shots are taken with the focus shifted a fraction between each frame, covering all distances from one end of the subject to the other. Now some experimentation with the aperture and the step size is required, but typically 50 to 100 shots are ideal for this kind of subject and angle. This sequence of images must then be stacked into a single composite image using software. Now some cameras can do this by themselves, sadly not a Sony yet, but for the greatest control and quality I'd still recommend using dedicated applications like Helicon Focus as seen here. I found this can deliver better results even than Photoshop's stacking tools. So once again here's a single frame at f5.6, and now here's the completed focus stack made using Helicon Focus. I used 120 shots here and used the default settings in Helicon Focus to align and stack them, and that process compensated for the somewhat pronounced focus breathing that you experience at these very close distances. And here's a stack sequence taken with the Sony lens and 2x teleconverter for a 2.8:1 reproduction, where the coin almost looks like a portion of a manhole cover. Flowers can also respond well to stacked macro photography, especially indoors when there's no wind to move them about during the burst. This and the previous shot were taken with the lens alone at 1.4:1. None of these are cropped and all were stacked images made with helican focus. Stacking isn't just for the maximum reproduction either. Here's a single frame of a sliced lemon at f5.6, followed by a version made with 100 images to ensure it's sharp from front to back. Autofocus makes focus bracketing very simple to execute, and I'm pleased it's now included on new Sony bodies. Maybe they'll even offer in-camera stacking in the future. Fingers crossed, eh? But autofocus is useful for more than just making tiny consecutive steps for a bracketing sequence. So now let's have a look at the lens focusing in a more normal environment from about a meter away. First in single AFS mode, where it's looking pretty confident and fairly swift. Now it's not instant by any means, but quick enough for most. Switching to continuous AFC mode speeds it up a little, but again, it's not instant. But how useful is the autofocus at very close range? To find out, I moved closer to the minimum focusing distance for the maximum 1.4:1 reproduction. Here you can see that while the focus pull inevitably takes longer to rack back and forth, the lens and body have absolutely no issues nailing the focus at either end. This is a lens that you can confidently use in autofocus even when delivering the maximum magnification from the closest focusing distance. Of course, you are relying on the AF area being over the exact part of the subject that you want to be in focus, but that's where the DMF mode comes in. Here I've used the autofocus to quickly get the lens close to the desired area, before then fine-tuning using the manual focusing ring. If preferred, you can also quickly switch to full manual focus and also benefit from the magnified assistance. Depending on the subject, the distance and the conditions, I found it was actually quite easy to nail the subject focus using a combination of these techniques, making it a quick and responsive lens in what's often a very challenging environment. To illustrate this again, I visited my friend and fellow YouTuber Elliot Cole, who often reviews watches and other timepieces. He kindly let me use his studio space and some of his subjects. So first, here's a view of a whole wristwatch, where I used autofocus and DMF to fine-tune. And now here it is at the closest distance for 1.4:1 reproduction, where the depth of field has become unforgivably shallow. I filmed this at f5.6 and 8000 ISO. Note, like all macro lenses, the effective aperture decreases at closer distances, and I found that the light gathering began to dim from about 70 centimeters onwards. By the time you reach the maximum 1.4:1, you'll have lost around 2 stops, making f2.8 act more like f5.6 in terms of exposure. Here's another example, showing a neat clock that uses tubes to illuminate the characters. It's about 15 centimeters wide. And now again at 1.4:1 to show how close you can get to those subjects. But with a teleconverter, it's possible to get even closer still. So first, here's a watch mechanism filmed at 1.4:1, which is the maximum reproduction using the lens by itself. And now with a Sony 2x teleconverter fitted, doubling the reproduction to 2.8:1, the depth of field has become ridiculously narrow, and of course video can't benefit from focus stacking, but the potential for filming tiny worlds is amazing. Do check out Elliot's channels if you'd like to see more. But these were static subjects, so how about continuous autofocus for video? Let's start with something nice and easy, a typical portrait distance, illustrating not just the tracking with human detection, but also the kind of subject separation you can expect at the maximum aperture of f2.8. So far so good, but how close can I get to the lens and still expect decent autofocus? Now please don't be too alarmed, as I'm gonna get closer and closer to the lens, approaching the minimum focusing distance, where my eye is gonna pretty much fill the frame. Here I've had to switch to a single AF area, as subject recognition would normally be looking for an entire face, but it is impressive how continuous AF is still working pretty seamlessly here and at the maximum aperture of f2.8 too. For a more traditional macro test, I visited the Butterfly Gardens at Middleton Common Farm near Burgess Hill in Sussex. Here you can walk through a polytunnel filled with loads of exotic butterflies, many posing nice and still for photographers. It is, however, an extremely humid environment, and for the first 10 minutes or so, the camera and lens were fogged up and dripping with condensation, but thankfully with no ill effects. As the system acclimatized, I was able to take lots of photos and videos, all handheld. I initially tried out insect subject detection on the camera, which certainly placed a box over most of the bodies of the butterflies, but I found that their eyes were rarely in focus at close range, so I switched to a small single AF area positioned over the eyes. For these video clips, I relied on continuous autofocus without any manual fine-tuning, and I'd say it's done a pretty good job. Remember, these clips are also handheld, using the combination of optical steady shot in the lens and IBIS in the body. Now for a selection of still photos of the butterflies, again all handheld and single frames. Cameras with faster electronic bursts may be able to capture a handheld focus stack, but the slower speed of the A7R5 meant that I was only capturing single frames in this environment. Most of these were also taken at an aperture of f8, as at larger apertures the shallow depth of field meant very little of the butterflies was actually sharp, but f8 coupled with pretty low light in the polytunnel and the light loss at close focusing distance meant that I was having to sometimes shoot at pretty high ISOs to achieve quick enough shutter speeds to freeze them even with stabilization. Now, while some of the butterflies were keeping very still, the plants they were resting on were often gently swaying, so I found that I needed a shutter speed of about 400th of a second for reliably sharp results under these conditions. At best, when under semi-direct sunlight, this meant a sensitivity of around 400 ISO, but increasing to about 3200 ISO under slightly shaded conditions. But the high ISO performance on the A7R5 is pretty good, and the outer camera results here look great. Remember, you could also run a RAW file through additional noise reduction later. I've got a couple more macro tests for you before moving on to more general distances. Now, some macro lenses suffer from a shift in focus as you close their apertures. It's been reported on the Canon RF100 macro, so I wanted to test it out on the new Sony. So here I've angled a ruler and manually focused in the very centre of the frame where the two line markings cross. This was taken at the maximum aperture of f2.8. The focusing was then left unchanged as I closed the aperture down. As the aperture becomes smaller, the depth of field of course broadens, but from this test I'd say the originally focused position, where the two lines cross in the middle, remains essentially unchanged. Certainly it wasn't an issue when I tested the lens. And finally, before moving on, here's a focus breathing test where I manually adjusted the focus from infinity to the closest distance and back again. As the lens focuses closer, you'll see the field of view gradually reduce, almost like a zoom lens, and the effect is quite substantial. But this is actually normal for most macro lenses, and the magnification at close range is of course a benefit for the maximum reproduction, and as seen earlier in my review, it could also be compensated for quite effectively during focus stacking with proper software. In fact, I'd say the only real issue with breathing here is when you're manually fine-tuning the focus and seeing the subject, especially if you're using a magnified view, moving a little bit across the frame. It can be a little bit disconcerting unless it's dead center. Now, after all these close-up tests, it's easy to forget that a macro lens can also be great for shooting at more normal distances. In fact, some of them can be really good for portraits or even landscapes. So let's first point it at Brighton Pier, and as always, angle it so that details run into the corners. You're looking at the lens at f2.8 here, and taking a close look in the middle of the frame reveals a tremendous amount of real-life detail and no real issues to report. As I stop the lens down, I wouldn't say there's any benefit to the subject's sharpness, so the lens is already performing at or pretty close to its best when wide open. So back to the f2.8 sample before heading into the far corner. Here I'd say there might be the very slightest hint of softening, but this is major pixel peeping and most would be very happy with it wide open from this distance. As I close the aperture, there's barely any difference to report, although by f8 it's arguably a tad crisper in the extremes, but again that is excessive pixel peeping in action. So let's now move on to a portrait test, and you've already seen the kind of depth of field that's possible at 100mm f2.8. Unsurprisingly, it's not going to be as blurred in the background as a brighter lens, and the broader depth of field means it'll inevitably be a little bit busier in the background too. But the bokeh and rendering looks reasonably smooth, but if you zoom into their details, you'll see just how sharp this lens can be. Now this is still at the maximum aperture, and the details are pretty much as crisp as I've seen on any portrait lens test. While this of course can be unforgiving on your subject, the sheer quality here remains impressive. Put it this way, it'll easily perform double duty as a decent portrait lens. What's that you say? You want to see a macro portrait? Okay, here's my eye again, bloodshot thanks to the endless hours I put into these reviews. But you can still see how close you can get. How about rendering of bokeh blobs? Here's my fairy light test, first from a more reasonable distance and at the maximum aperture of f2.8. Here there's some elongation of the blobs towards the corners, but I'm pleased to see minimal outlining or textures within, in contrast to the earlier 90mm macro, which often looked like it was rendering out tiny Death Star blobs at times. Close to f4, most of the blobs have become more uniformly circular across the frame, while the shape of the 11-bladed diaphragm becomes more apparent as the aperture closes further. To be fair, the blobs aren't immune to artifacts, but it's still looking better to me than the 90mm did in my tests. But remember, this is a macro lens, so let's get much closer to the ornament, and this isn't even as close as it'll focus. I took this at f2.8 where the blobs have become absolutely enormous, but the interesting part is how the diaphragm system can become more apparent when focused at very close range, even with the aperture wide open. As I close the aperture, you'll see the blobs rendered into more defined geometric shapes, reflecting the 11-bladed diaphragm system inside. And that's all the tests that I've got for you, so let's now wrap up while showing a few more samples. The FE 100mm f2.8 MACRO GM becomes not only Sony's best macro lens to date, but the best macro lens that I've personally tested on any system. For starters, it'll deliver 1.4:1 reproduction, which is comfortably greater than the 1:1 of most macro lenses. But while Canon's latest RF macro also shares that same maximum reproduction, the Sony uniquely allows you to also use teleconverters to deliver 2:1 or 2.8:1, greatly beating its rival and especially the original FE 90mm. As a modern G Master lens, there's also plenty of resolution to support teleconverters with superb details possible at any distance, whether you're photographing insects, people, or even landscapes. Plus, the rendering did look cleaner than the old 90mm to me. Crucially, it's also a very practical and easy lens to shoot with, thanks to improved weather sealing, effective stabilization, a very usable minimum focusing distance that won't shade or scare your subjects away, and decent autofocusing throughout. And remember, while some of the most specialist macro lenses out there may also offer 2:1 or greater, all are manual focus only, making them much slower to use, especially when focus bracketing. In contrast, autofocus allows the new Sony Macro to quickly and easily grab a focus bracketed sequence without extra equipment, even at up to 2.8:1 reproduction. In my tests so far, I couldn't really find any serious issues with it, and while the price is higher than its predecessor and Canon's RF macro, it outperforms or outfeatures both of them. So if you're into macro photography, you're going to adore this lens, and I can actually see some people switching systems to be able to use it. You kept us waiting a long time for a new macro lens, Sony, but you've knocked it out the park. And that's it for this review, which, as I'm sure you could see, involved a huge amount of work. So in the absence of a sponsor, I'd love if you could give it a like, and if you also have time, please do check out my coffee channel, where I review some of the best cafes around the world. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.